Mic test. Okay. And the way we do it here is I read one verse, and then the congregation reads one verse, and then the last verse we read together. And he brought back all the goods, and also brought again his brother Lot and his goods, and the women also, and the people. Oh, and you don't have to read the blue text. These are just like side notes. And Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought forth bread and wine, and he was the priest of the Most High God. And blessed be the Most High God, which has delivered your enemies into your hand. And he gave him tithes of all. And Abram said to the king of Sodom, I have lifted up my hand to the Lord, the Most High God, the possessor of heaven and earth. Together? Except only that which the young men have eaten, and the portion of the men which went with me, Aner, Eshcol, and Mamre. Let them take their portion. Amen. You may be seated. Okay, so have you guys heard of a guy named Abraham? So this is before Abraham became Abraham, because he used to be called Abram until God changed his name. So the story thus far is God brought Abram out of this place called Ur, which is Babylonia. And actually, can we get a map of the big map? Because we have new people here. So this is a part of a series. So you guys, if you're not familiar with like the story, today's sermon might not make like any sense. So he used to be around this area, Abram was. And then he moved out of here, and he trekked all the way up there, and then down here. And then he ended up staying in this area. So it's a long trek. And what happened was he brought with him, not brought with him, Lot, his nephew, followed him. Because of the promises that God gave to Abraham, Lot was like, I want a piece of that promise as well. So Lot followed him. But what ended up happening was towards this side of this area, it was like a lot of water and a lot of greenery. So Lot's like, maybe I'll just stay over there instead of following Abram. So he left Abram for that spot called Sodom and Gomorrah. And as soon as he left, the kings of this area, so this area right here called the Fertile Crescent, the kings of this area was like, hey, there's a lot of stuff over there that they have because it's so like watery. So they went over and attacked, the 4 kings from here went over and attacked the 5 kings over here, and they took everything, including Lot. So they took them as prisoners, they took the booty, right? And Abram, with his 318 servants, went out, chased the 4 kings, and killed them all. We're like, how does 318 people, kill an army of 4 kings? So we're talking about like God's special providence here. So he went out, killed them all, brought them all back with Lot, and then the first thing that Abram does is meet with God's high priest named Melchizedek, and that's the story of today. Who this Melchizedek guy is, why did Abram meet him after he defeated the 4 kings? So last week, so the reason why the Melchizedek king guy is important, you go to the New Testament, and it says, unless you understand Jesus Christ in the light of the priesthood, who Jesus Christ is as priest of God. If you don't understand that, you can't grow in Christ. That's from the book of Hebrews. And the author of Hebrews, his point is to make sure we understand it's the priesthood of Jesus Christ and our identification with that priesthood. So when we consider ourselves as priests in union with Jesus Christ, so we go, we're the priest of God because Jesus Christ is a priest of God. When we identify ourselves as such, because we understand Jesus Christ, that's when we begin to mature in God. We begin to mature as Christians. In other words, it is necessary for us to identify as God's priest. It's necessary. Why is it so important that we understand this priesthood thing? Because as a priest, there's a thing you tend to, or a thing that you're guarding or keeping or dressing. There's a thing that you're tending to. question for you guys. What is a priest? What is a priest? Okay. That's one of his responsibilities. That's very correct. But it's more than that. Those are specific jobs that he has. But it might be more important to talk about how do you recognize a priest? Right? How do you recognize one? Well, in the Old Testament, the priests were not allowed to be, I mean, it's not just the Old Testament because it also affects us in the New Testament, but you could tell who's a priest by where they are and where they can go and where they can't go. Does that make sense? So usually a priest is around, like, inside the temple of God. And they're, cleaning everything, or like, because if you think about it, when you offer sacrifices, there's all this, like, blood and animal entrails and, like, poop, right? Especially the blood. Who's going to do the cleaning? The priest, right? It's not the normal people. They can't come inside to that area of the temple because it's sectioned off as holy. Only the priests can go there. So by knowing who's there, and in the Old Testament, this is not in the New Testament, but in the Old Testament, if, let's say, somebody who was not a priest decided to go to where that altar was, right, or go beyond that altar, it was the responsibility of the priest to kill the guy so that the guy doesn't profane God's temple. So you can tell who the priest is by where he is and what he's doing. In other words, you have to have the temple first to have a priest. Does that make sense? If you don't have a temple, there's no priest. You could say you're a priest all you want, and you go, well, where do you serve? And they would say, well, I have no home. Okay, then you're not a priest. The temple comes first, logically speaking, and then you have the priest. In other words, the priest is identified by the temple that he serves. So, and this is just kind of obvious, if you serve the temple of Satan, whose priest are you? Because there is such a thing as temple of Satan. It's in Chicago. Right? If you serve as in the temple of Satan, whose priest are you? Yeah, Satan's temple, right? It's Satan's priest. If you serve in God's temple, whose priest are you? God's, right? So that's what we're getting at, is the priest is identified what temple he's serving under. And now this is important because and we're going to get a little bit technical here, and like it might be theologically like deep, but maybe you guys can sort of like understand what's being said here. The reason why a priest of God is set apart as the priest of God is because he's serving somebody that's utterly holy. Holy, holy, utterly. What do we mean by that? From your, whatever Christian background or whatever things you've heard about Christianity, do you know if the term holy has been used in any other case other than the Christian God? So, for instance, have you ever heard of like somebody say, "Oh, the Holy Satanic Church"? Or have you ever like the Holy Hindus? Have you heard that? Even when the Muslims were doing during the Ottoman Empire, when the Muslims were doing the crusade, were their crusades called the Holy Crusade? The Muslim Crusades. Was the Muslim Crusades called the Holy Crusades? No, see, the term holy, the entire world knows the term holy is only applied to Christians. Well, there's a reason for that. So just to recap, in order to mature as Christians, we have to identify as priests of God. And then it's something about identifying as priests of God in Jesus Christ, right? So Jesus Christ is the priest of God. We're a priest of God. It's something about identifying as a priest of God. That's the mechanism for helping us to grow or mature as Christians. And it has to do with who God is in his holiness. In his holiness. To begin with, when God says he is holy, and we'll read some of the verses, when God says he is holy, it's not saying like God is some sort of quantitatively like a better God or some sort of, or maybe I should do it this way. When I say God is holy, or when God says he says, like, what comes to your mind when God says he's holy? What comes to mind? Because I want to deconstruct that. Because it's not the same kind of sort of like how we think about what holy is. If you like study the Bible, there's a different way that it's being explained. So when somebody says God is holy, like, what do you normally think about? Sacred. Right, sacred. Maybe set apart. Yeah, good. Maybe something like not like other things around him. Like he's uniquely good or something. These are all good definitions. But they actually flow from a much deeper definition, which is God's character is nothing like the things he created. So he absolutely transcends creation itself. He's the foundation for why Christian exists. So you might have heard the term of like proof of God, right? There's no such thing as proof of God, because if you were to talk about the proof of God, you're saying it's the proof that determines whether or not God is God or not. If that's the case, who's the real God there? God or the proof? Does that make sense? Because if you need the proof to prove that God exists, then the proof is God. Because when the proof is gone, you're saying there's no God. Does that make sense? So what we're trying to say here is that's not possible with the God that we believe in as Christians. He utterly transcends creation so that there's nobody like God. There's no creation like God. God is the creator. We're the creatures. There is a creator-creature distinction. That's what we're getting at here. So these are not my words. This is from Deuteronomy 4:35 and 1 Samuel chapter 2, verse 2. So to you it was shown, the Israelites, in order that you might know that the Lord, he is God. Not the Egyptian gods that you came out from, right? But the Lord himself is God. And there is none else beside him. There's nobody like God. That's what Moses is saying to the Israelites. So the Israelites were in bondage for 400 and some years in Egypt, and they learned the Egyptian ways, and they got used to the Egyptian idols. And when they came out of Egypt, Moses is saying, those idols that you worship, they don't come close to who God is, qualitatively. There is none like the God that I'm telling you about. This is 1 Samuel chapter 2, verse 2. Hannah praising God because he gave her, she was barren, but he gave her children. There is none holy as the Lord. There's that word, none holy as the Lord. For there is none beside you, neither is there any rock like our God. So Hannah's confessing the same thing. She understands there is no other beings that's like God. And that's because this is like 2 out of 40 plus references. And this is because God transcends creation. He's the foundation for everything that exists right now. In other words, God is absolutely, completely, utterly transcendent. So transcendent, nothing about God is comprehensible or knowable. Nothing about God is comprehensible or knowable to us. But then if you're sort of like anticipating where I'm going with this, you might be thinking, Pastor Tom, we have a concept of who this God is. So that means he's not utterly transcendent, because if he was utterly transcendent, we would have no idea about who he is. Does that make sense? We wouldn't know anything about the God, that the Christians claim if he's utterly transcendent. So here's an example to demonstrate that. You guys know what colors are, right? If I say, think about a red color, can you picture in your mind what that looks like? Okay. So try to think about a color you've never seen before. You can't, because it's outside of your experience. That's what transcendent means. It means it's outside of your experience. So the Bible is saying God is utterly outside of our experience. He's holy, transcendent. He's above creation, which is how he's able to become the foundation. In other words, there's no creation proof for the existence of God. God himself is the proof for the existence of creation. In other words, and this is something just plainly obvious, something can't come from nothing. You have to have something to have something. So you can't have creation unless you have something before creation. Whatever that is. You know? Does that make sense? And you can't have more from less. Nothing in our experience tells us you get more when you have less. Does that make sense? In other words, whoever God is infinite, without limits, without finiteness. From the infinite, you can get to the finite because it's just a portion of the infinite. Does that make sense? Yeah, so God becomes the proof for creation, but you can't have proof from creation to God. That's not possible. Because God is utterly transcendent. But if he's utterly transcendent, how are we able to have a concept of who this God is? Well, doesn't that mean he's relatable to some degree? Doesn't that mean something about God is relatable to us? Otherwise, we would be able to not think about him at all, just like the color that we can't think about since there's no experience of that color we had no experience about. Does that make sense? Right. So when you think in that way, go, something about God must be relatable to us. When you think in those terms, that's actually a pagan way of thinking. It's a pagan way, not a Christian way. Here's what I mean. So here's one of the confessions of faith or catechism called the Westminster Confession of Faith in 1647. And this is under section 7.1 of God's covenant with man. And it's just in one sentence, it's trying to explain what's going on in order that God is utterly unknowable, and yet we know him somehow. How does that happen? The distance between God and the creature is so great that although reasonable creatures do owe obedience unto him as their creator, yet they could never have any fruition of him as their blessedness and reward, but by some voluntary condescension on God's part, which he has been pleased to express by way of covenant. Next slide. So here's the annotated version, in case you guys need to go to, like, you know, if you guys are taking philosophy, I don't know if you guys are, but, and you want to sort of like show off to your professor and say, oh, you know, professor, all the things you've learned, I know something that'll, like, you know, knock your socks off. It's this annotated version of that. The distance of being. So when it says the distance between God and the creature is so great, it's talking about distance of being. Meaning we actually have a similar being with like everything else because we're created. And the only distance between us and every other creature is that we're made in God's image and no other creation is. So that's our distance. It's a qualitative distance. So we're not animals, contrary to what, I mean, from the Christian point of view, we're not animals. Contrary to what we're learning in, you know, science and philosophy, we're actually made in God's image, meaning we're an imitation of who God is. And because of that, we have a qualitative difference between dogs and chairs and rocks and, like, the sun. We have a qualitative difference. But the qualitative difference between God and us is so great, that gap is so great, that although reasonable creatures, and it's just talking about creatures that are able to reason, so we're just talking about people here, or if you believe in angels as well. Reasonable creatures do owe obedience unto him because God created us, okay? Yet, they could never have any fruition or enjoyment derived as their blessedness and reward, except by some voluntary condescension. Do you guys know what condescension means? Condescension is to sort of like go down to somebody's level. So if you're, let's say there's like a king, and he wants to see if there's like poor people in his kingdom, and he's like helping out the poor, then the king is condescending to look over his people. So condescension means to like come down to their level, stoop to their level. So unless God stoops to our level, so from God's part, unless he stoops to our level, which he has been expressed by way of covenant, or which he has been pleased to express by way of covenant. So unless God made a covenant, and in that covenant stooped down to our level, we could never have any fruition. We can never even know who God is. So the fact that we know God means God condescended to our level. That's what it's talking about. God is utterly unknowable, but he condescended. He did something from himself out towards us, from the infinite to the finite, so that now we have some knowledge of God. And that thing that God did is called a covenant. That's what it's talking about. And in this context of, if you read the whole thing, the context is knowledge of God. So what that means is God gave us his knowledge. So we're not able to come up and derive and come from our own experience who God is. That's not possible. But God condescended himself, and then he told us who he is. And God did this through two ways. One is called natural revelation, which is the creation, and special revelation, which is the word of God that you know as like the Bible. So actually, all these created things tell us something about God, whatever it is. It tells us something about God. So for instance, do you guys know, if I were to say, describe the color red, how would you describe it?
In relation to other things that are red.
Yeah, anything, or how would you describe red?
An apple, for example.
Yeah. So how would you describe it? You would say it's what our eyes perceive that thing to be? Do you know what I mean? Like, how would you describe the color red? I could start this. Red is a property of color, right? It's a property of color, which is why we have like infrared, which is like under that visible color. Then you have, whatever that, ultraviolet, which is past that visible light. Does that make sense? So you could say, color is red is a property of color. Red is a word, that's describing that concept of the thing we're seeing. So in other words, I see the color red, but I'm trying to get across to you what that thing that I'm seeing is. So I have to use a word to describe what I'm seeing. Does that make sense? So there's the concept, and there's the word that I need to use to describe what I'm seeing. What about numbers? So in other words, like red actually falls into a certain category of an order. There's an order of visible spectrum, and then let's say there's like an order of like light spectrum, and then there's the order in that category of a light spectrum, the visible light spectrum, and under that category there's the red spectrum, or the red whatever it is. So you have like shades of red. Does that make sense? So there's an order is the point. Do you know what I'm talking about? There's an order to the color red. How do we know there's an order? If I were to say, hey, look over there, does any of that look red to you at the back? The shiny. If I said, does any of that look red to you? If you're able to say no, it's because there's a standard, there's an order, a parameter you guys have that determines whether or not that's red. Does that make sense? The fact that you guys have a parameter means there's an order to what red is. And if you sort of like don't understand what that's about, let's talk about the number system. Is there an order to the number system? Okay? How do you know there's an order? If I said, here's a screen, right? If I said there's two screens there, what would you say? You would say, no, there isn't. There's only one screen. And I'll say, well, why would you say that? You would say something like, because numbers have an order, and two is not one. Does that make sense? Red is not blue. There's an order. Red is not green. One is not 10,000. Does that make sense? That order reveals to us something about God's character. Meaning, something about God doesn't change. Something about God, and he's revealing that through creation, through the things that we see. So for instance, you wouldn't expect me to just fall through the floor, right? Well, why is that? Because the molecules and the atoms here and the laws of physics, they have an order. And because it has an order, we can see a pattern and expect it to follow that pattern. That's the mind of God being expressed. That's God's holiness being expressed. And that's what we're getting at as priests of God, this order of God. So that's the first thing, is God's natural or general revelation. That's the things that we can know about God through creation. We can know to a degree what kind of character God is in terms of order, but we don't know what God is actually thinking or like what his value system is. These things are out of our experience. And these are unknowable except if God told us. And here we're, of course, assuming God did tell us, not only through the Bible, but through history, through the prophets. So what are we talking about? Well, number system has an order. You could say that's sort of like an objective or sort of like outside of us thing. What about a moral system? Is there an order in the moral system? What about the aesthetic system? Is there an order in the aesthetic system? So here's what I'm talking about. There's an information that's being presented, and it conforms, it aligns itself to how God perceives that information. That information is called fact or the truth. Does that make sense? So there's an information that I want to convey, and it conforms to how God perceives that information. So for instance, when God created the color red, God had what red should look like in his mind. So he created red according to that property. Does that make sense? And then I come along and I go, no, that's blue. Is that the truth? Well, why isn't it the truth? It's because it's going against the order of the color red that it was meant or intended to be. That's why. And if we don't have that concept, so now we're talking about if you're not a Christian, you can't make sense of the world that you live in because there is no such thing as order without God founding that order. So for instance, if you ask a non-Christian, is red blue? And they say no. My question would be, well, how can you say that? If you boil it down, aren't you just basically saying, trust me? Isn't that what they're essentially saying? Whatever thing they're asserting, they're basically saying, trust me. Does that make sense? They can say, this is like, yeah, there's 10 screens up here. How can you say that? How can you say that? Well, what's the difference between 10 and 1? If there's no order. If there is order, where does that order come from? Because something can't come from nothing. Do you guys sort of understand what I'm talking about? I'm talking about order here. I'm talking about there's a God, he has an order, and there is, if there's such a thing as a number system order, physics order, the way molecules work order, biological order, if there's such a thing as order, the colors, how colors are presented, if there's no shapes, a square is not a triangle. If there's an order to that, right, then there is such a thing as an order to the moral system, the aesthetic system, and more. When the moral order conforms to God's moral order, as God revealed his holiness, we're talking about through the prophets in the Bible now, then we call that righteousness or good. So you heard the term good before, right? You heard the term righteousness before? What are the standards for using those words? Because remember, what words do is there's a concept, and words try to describe that concept to communicate to somebody else. So I'm talking about something that's good. You see? So I'm trying to convey to you a concept or a notion called good is what I'm trying to convey to you. And the question is, if I don't have any foundation for that, essentially all I'm saying to you is, you got to trust me. I'm saying it's good because you got to trust me. I think this is right because you got to trust me. Whereas a Christian is saying, this conforms to God's holiness, who he is in his character. That's why it's right. This conforms to God in his character. That's why it's good. This does not conform to God and his character. That's why it's not good or not right. Does that make sense? Okay. What about beauty? What about beauty? You go, wow, that's beautiful. Have you been to Rome? Like I said, I'm not Roman Catholic, but I think everybody should be able to visit the capital, Rome, and see the pillars that go all the way in. You can look at a picture online, but it doesn't capture for at least from the people that who's been to Rome, it doesn't capture the sensation when they're there, which is the pillars that are set up. They're very beautiful, and it's very welcoming. And as somebody figured out why, you can look at this online. It's because they're arms. The pillars, right? They're meant to convey a sense of come to me. And it's that warmth that makes it go, wow, that's very beautiful. When the perception of something allows our mind to partake in something about God's holiness, we recognize it and go, that looks like something about God's holiness because of the way that's ordered. That's called beauty. And we don't have time to get into it today, but that's why you hear things like, especially mathematicians talk about the golden ratio a lot, or the number E or the number pi. That's why they talk about these things, because the way these things are ordered, it's not fact. but it gets us to something about God's holiness. It sort of like gets us a glimpse of what God's holiness is like. And we go, we can't put words into what we're seeing here, but it's very pleasing. That's beauty. And priests, we're tending to, or we're guarding, or we're keepers of that order of holiness. That's what priests are. Priests tend to the temple or tend to the order that comes out of God's holiness. And this order is usually called God's word or God's commandments or the laws of God. So here's the laws of Moses. 2 Kings chapter 23, 25. So there's such a thing called, all I'm trying to do is show you like biblical language of what I'm talking about here, which is what the Bible's talking about, and it's just an order. There's a physical order, a moral order, and an aesthetic order. And like unto him, there was no king before him that turned to the Lord with all his heart, talking about David, and with all his soul and with all his might, according to all the law of Moses. So there's such a thing as law of Moses, okay? And then 1 Corinthians 16:40, there's such a thing as laws of God. It's the same thing. To offer burnt offerings to the Lord upon the altar of the burnt offering, continually morning and evening, and to do according to all that is written in the law of the Lord. It's the same thing as the law of Moses. There's the law of faith. Where is the boasting then? It is excluded. By what law? How can you exclude boasting? By what law is it excluded? Of works? The law of works? No, but the law of faith. Next slide. There's the law of Christ. For the law of the Spirit of life in Christ Jesus has made me free from the law of sin and death. There is a law of liberty, or law of righteousness, but Israel, which followed after the law of righteousness, has not attained to the law of righteousness. And then a law of Christ, perfect law. All this is saying is, you guys know what laws are, right? How would you describe laws? What is a law? But why is it there? Yeah, it's an expression of order. You're saying, okay, it seems like the world doesn't make sense, but here's a law that expresses what should be the orderly way of doing things. And the people go, that's a good law. It's a good expression of order. Or that's a bad law. It's a bad expression of what order should be. Does that make sense? Yeah, and all these talking about the laws of this, laws of that. It's just talking about there's an order within God, and it comes out of his holiness. And if you understand God's holiness, then the world makes sense, because then you understand where this order is all coming from. But if you're not a Christian, right, you're constantly thinking, well, why is this the case? So for instance, let's say a lot of people gossip about you. What's wrong with gossiping? What's wrong with gossiping? It gets convoluted, and then by the time it gets to the last person, it's a whole different story. Yeah, but why is that bad? I'm not trying to get conspiratorial, but isn't that what the CIA does anyway? Isn't that what the FBI does anyway? Right? Why is it bad? Well, if you're a Christian, we can say why it's bad. All forms of lies goes against God's truth. So God doesn't perceive the information you're carrying out in that way. Whatever gossip you're talking about this person, God didn't perceive it that way. Right? So by the fact that you're communicating the thing opposite or against that order of God, that's why it's not right. That's why there's something wrong with it. So in the Christian worldview, it makes sense why that's not right. But if you're not Christian, from what foundation can you say, okay, like this is not right, this is right. This is good, this is not good. How can you say that? Let's say you stab somebody in the back. You're a backstabber. What's wrong with backstabbing people? By what authority can you say, hey, you should be backstabbing people? That's wrong. And again, I'm not trying to be conspiratorial here, but CIA backstabs like other nations all the time, right? But then when we say, hey, that's wrong, CIA should be not doing that. How can we make that claim is the question. By what authority can we say, okay, there's an order to the universe, and there's a moral order to our actions here, and what you're doing goes against that moral order. How can we establish that is the question. And that's what we're trying to get at here. You can only establish that, not only establish, but in a Christian worldview, it makes sense why you can establish that. But in any other worldview, how can you work that out? Because we're saying there's a transcendent God that grounds what creation is, and the order comes from him. And therefore we can say, well, it doesn't conform to God's character in his holiness. Therefore it's not right. So we can have like a trail of like why we believe it's not. But I'm saying apart from that, how can you say that? So all these things are getting at the same thing, which is God reveals his holiness by his word, namely the creation, which he spoke by his word, and his direct words, the special or supernatural revelation of God, which is he gave through the mouths of his prophets and the Bible that we have. And the priests of God, so then as priests of God, our temple is God himself. And the order from that which flows from God's holiness, that's what we're enforcing as priests. That's the thing that we're upkeeping, guarding, tending for, dressing up. Okay, 4 minutes over. Any questions or comments? Okay, if no questions or comments, then let's pray. Let's collect offering, and then